The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Lord of life, help us to know you better, that we may love you more. Provide our lawmakers opportunities to be guided by your wisdom and strengthened by your presence. May your presence lead them to a spiritual maturity that will honor you. Grant that this maturity will inspire them to be a part of the solution and not part of the problem. Show our senators what they can do to lead our nation toward a more perfect union. Stay close to us, mighty God, for we are your children. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President,
The Senator from Hawaii.
I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Iowa is recognized.
I ask the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Veterans Affairs, Dennis Richard McDonough of Maryland to be Secretary.
Madam President,
Senator from Iowa.
in his inaugural address, President Biden said his whole soul, quote unquote, was in the cause of, quote, bringing America together, uniting our people, and uniting our nation, end of quote. Very worthy things to speak, and especially in an inaugural address. He also recognized that Americans have serious disagreements. Everyone knows that our country is deeply divided politically. I know from his time in the Senate that President Biden understands that people of goodwill can have honest disagreements about policy. So he knows that unity does not mean dropping deeply held beliefs and accepting his own policy agenda. As he said, and I have two quotes here, every disagreement doesn't have to be a cause of total war, and disagreement must not lead to disunion. Real unity requires rediscovering what binds us together as Americans, even when we have strongly disagreed politically. As I have often said, our nation is unique in human history in that it was founded not on the basis of common ethnic identity or loyalty to, let's say, a monarch, but on certain enduring principles. Those principles are best articulated in simple but eloquent words of the Declaration of Independence. And you all read these regularly, I'm sure. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End of quote. It is a common commitment to this ideal that has bound us together as Americans from the beginning. Our patriot forefathers concluded that these principles were worth fighting for and took up arms in an improbable quest to defeat the largest and best trained military at that particular time. This included many black patriots who fought for American independence, a unifying fact that I believe deserves a monument on the National Mall, something that I've been working for years. Now I want to quote Margaret Thatcher. She once observed this, a fairly long quote, so bear with me. "Americans and Europeans alike sometimes forget how unique is the United States of America. No other nation has been created so swiftly and successfully. No other nation has been built upon an idea, the idea of liberty. No other nation has so successfully combined people of different races and nations within a single culture. Both the founding fathers of the United States and successive waves of immigrants to your country were determined to create a new identity, whether in flight from persecution or from poverty. The huddled masses have, with few exceptions, welcomed American values, the American way of life, and American opportunities. And America herself has bound them to her with powerful bonds of patriotism and pride.
The European nations, Thatcher continues, are not and can never be like this. They are the product of history, not of philosophy. End of Thatcher's quote. This quote from a British leader is one of the best summaries that I have read about Americans' exceptionalism. The term American exceptionalism is often misunderstood, perhaps due to a quirk of the English language. Merriam-Webster's dictionary gives 3 definitions of exceptional. 1, forming an exception, like, as they give an example, rare, an exceptional number of rainy days. Or 2, better than average, superior exceptional skill is the words they expand on average. Deviating from the norm, such as having above or below average intelligence or physical disability. Many people here and abroad assume that those who talk about American exceptionalism are just using the second definition and simply asserting that the United States is better than any other country. And that is a wrong interpretation. American exceptionalism is an assertion of the plain fact that America's foundation is very different from that of most other nations. However, our foundation is increasingly under attack from both the right and the left. Both the 1619 Project and white nationalists assert that America's founding principles are a lie and that the United States was founded along ethnic lines. Oddly enough, this was the position taken by John C. Calhoun in the United States Senate when he articulated an alternative to the founding principles intended to justify maintaining slavery in perpetuity. Unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln, who revered the Declaration of Independence, prevailed. The notion that our founding principles are a lie isn't just bad history. It breaks the bonds that unite Americans of all backgrounds. The 1776 Commission was established specifically to, quote, enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776 and to strive to form a more perfect union, end of quote. The introduction to the 1776 report states that, quote, a rediscovery of our shared identity rooted in our founding principles is the path to a renewed American unity and a confidence in American future, end of quote. I could not agree more. That is why I was disappointed to see President Biden terminate this commission the same day he took office after making his call for unity. The call to unity is exactly what the president asked for in his inaugural address. What specifically in that 1776 commission document does President Biden disagree with? Yes, the report is critical of far-left efforts to denigrate our founding principles, but it is also an important corrective to the alt-right effort to import European styles ethno-nationalism, which is also deeply un-American in every sense. The 1776 report calls for, quote, a restoration of American education, which can only be grounded on a history of those principles that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling, end of quote. By contrast, California has proposed an ethnic study curriculum that is rooted in the fundamental divisive tenets of critical race theory, which, with its focusing on separate groups of Americans into different degrees of oppressor and oppressed. Interestingly, despite the California curriculum's focus on victims of prejudice, discussions of anti-Semitism is omitted in favor of criticism of Israel. This curriculum also totally skips over the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Remember his dream? So I quote that statement that he made. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, end of quote. Now, that is a very unifying statement. I encourage all Americans to read the 1776 report for yourself. See if you don't agree with the central message that shared attachment to our timeless founding principles is what binds us as a nation. It is no longer available on the main White House website, but can still be found on the Trump administration's archived website. It is also available on the Hillsdale College website. I have another short remark that I want to make on another subject. 12 years ago, this past Sunday, then Vice President Biden was in Munich, Germany, to deliver the Obama administration's first major foreign policy speech to world leaders. He said, quote, "It is time to press the reset button and to revisit the many areas where we can and should be working together with Russia," end of quote. The premise was that the Bush administration had been too tough on Russia, and a more conciliatory approach was needed. Beyond the rhetoric, this involved abruptly scrapping planned missile defense cooperation with our allies, the Czechs and the Poles, on the anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland. Keep in mind, this was 6 months after Russia had invaded and occupied territory of our ally, the Republic of Georgia, an occupation that is still ongoing this very day. That all happened a year after the publication of the book entitled The New Cold War by Edward Lucas, detailing the dangerous nature of the Putin regime. The Russian reset was not just a failure. The reset was ill-conceived and counterproductive from the start. Putin's Russia, like the Soviet Union before it, only understands strength. Unilateral concessions actually encourage further aggression, like we saw and still see with Ukraine. I appreciate now President Biden's more recent tough talk on Russia. I like his rhetoric better than many things that President Trump said. However, I like Trump's actions, like sanctions against the Nord Stream pipeline, arming and training the Ukrainian military, and pardoning with our frontline allies. The Biden administration no longer talks of a Russian reset, but it has already announced the extension of the one legacy of the reset policy. The New START Treaty with Russia gutted important monitoring and verification measures that were included in the predecessor agreement. President Reagan famously quoted a Russian proverb, "Trust but verify," when he was negotiating with Mikhail Gorbachev. New START cut out the verifying part, leaving only trust. But surely, we've all learned by now that we cannot trust Vladimir Putin. He has been caught red-handed violating other arms control treaties. So, as recently happened, extending the New START treaty without trying to improve it is a missed opportunity. I hope that President Biden's future actions more closely match his words, and he scraps all vestiges of the Obama-Russian reset policy that he announced 12 years ago this weekend. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President Pro Tem.
The Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Are we in a quorum called? I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now, Mr. President, the Senate is steadily confirming members of President Biden's cabinet and other key administration officials. In a few hours, we'll add one more to the list when the Senate confirms Dennis McDonough to serve as Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Under President Obama, Mr. McDonough was a member of the National Security Council and the White House Chief of Staff. He was a regular face at Walter Reed and a frequent visitor of our troops deployed abroad. The VA has one of the most sacred missions of all our agencies, deriving its motto from President Lincoln's second inaugural address, to care for those who shall have borne the battle. But the task of achieving that mission is one of organization, institutional know-how, and administrative troubleshooting. I'm confident that Mr. McDonough's decades of experience at the highest levels of government make him well qualified to take on the job. Even as senators prepare this week to sit as a court of impeachment, the Senate will continue its work on other responsibilities. Committees will continue to process nominations, including the nominees to lead the EPA, the Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, and the Office of Management and Budget. At the same time, committees will continue pressing the work of addressing the COVID crisis. Last week, in the early hours of Friday morning, the Senate passed a budget resolution that will pave the way for President Biden's American Rescue Plan. As promised, the Senate held an open, bipartisan, and vigorous amendment process. Several bipartisan amendments passed with overwhelming majorities and were added to the resolution. The fact that the debate went all night and only concluded at around 5:30 in the morning is a testament to the vigor of the amendment process, which, again, I note, was bipartisan. The First Amendment, in fact, a very important one, by the Senator from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, and the Senator from Mississippi, Mr. Wicker, helped our restaurant industry, and it was bipartisan. Now, our Senate committees have instructions to begin crafting legislation to rescue our country from COVID-19, to speed vaccination distribution, provide a lifeline to small businesses, help schools reopen safely, save the jobs of teachers, firefighters, and other public employees, and support every American who is struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. This important historic work will give hundreds of millions of Americans the relief they need, while getting our country back to normal as quickly as possible. Now on impeachment. Tomorrow, the second impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump will commence, only the fourth trial of a president or former president in American history, and the first trial for any public official that has been impeached twice. For the information of the Senate, the Republican leader and I, in consultation with both the House managers and former President Trump's lawyers, have agreed to a bipartisan resolution to govern the structure and timing of the impending trial. Let me say that again. All parties have agreed to a structure that will ensure a fair and honest Senate impeachment trial of the former president. Each side will have ample time to make their arguments, 16 hours over 2 days for the House managers, the same for the former president's counsel. If managers decide they want witnesses, there will be a vote on that, which is the option they requested in regard to witnesses. The trial will also accommodate a request from the former president's counsel to pause the trial during the Sabbath. The trial will break on Friday afternoon before sundown and will not resume until Sunday afternoon. As in previous trials, there will be equal time for senators' questions and for closing arguments, and an opportunity for the Senate to hold deliberations if it so chooses. And then we will vote on the article of impeachment. And if the former president is convicted, we will proceed to a vote on whether he is qualified to enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. The structure we have agreed to is eminently fair. It will allow for the trial to achieve its purpose, truth and accountability. That's what trials are designed to do, to arrive at the truth of a matter and render a verdict. And following the despicable attack on January the 6th, there must be truth and accountability if we are going to move forward, heal, and bring our country together once again. Sweeping something as momentous as this under the rug brings no healing whatsoever. Let's be clear about that. Now, as the trial begins, the forces aligned with the former president are prepared to argue that the trial itself is unconstitutional because Donald Trump is no longer in office, relying on a fringe legal theory that has been roundly debunked by constitutional scholars from across the political spectrum. Just yesterday, another very prominent conservative Republican constitutional lawyer, Chuck Cooper, wrote in the Wall Street Journal that Republicans are dead wrong if they think an impeachment trial of a former president is unconstitutional. Here's what he wrote, quote, "Given that the Constitution permits the Senate to impose the penalty of permanent disqualification only on former office holders, it defies logic to suggest that the Senate is prohibited from trying and convicting former office holders. The senators who supported Mr. Paul's motion should reconsider their view and judge the former president's misconduct on the merits." That's no liberal. That's Chuck Cooper, a lawyer who represented House Republicans in a lawsuit against Speaker Pelosi, a former advisor to Senator Cruz's presidential campaign, driving a stake into the central argument we're going to hear from the former president's counsel. Now, I understand why this fringe constitutional theory is being advanced. For the past few weeks, the political right has been searching for a safe harbor, a way to oppose the conviction of Donald Trump without passing judgment on his conduct, to avoid alienating the former president's supporters, without condoning his obviously despicable, unpatriotic, undemocratic behavior. But the truth is, no such safe harbor exists. The trial is clearly constitutional by every frame of analysis, by constitutional text, historical practice, Senate precedent, and basic common sense. A president cannot simply resign to avoid accountability for an impeachable offense, nor can they escape judgment by waiting until their final few weeks in office to betray our country. The impeachment powers assigned to the Congress by the Constitution cannot be defeated by a president who decides to run away or trashes our democracy on the way out the door. This trial will confirm that fact. The merits of the case against the former president will be presented, and the former president's counsel will mount a defense. Ultimately, senators will decide on the one true question at stake in this trial. Is Donald Trump guilty of inciting a violent mob against the United States? A mob whose purpose was to interfere with the constitutional process of counting electoral votes and ensuring a peaceful transfer of power. And if he is guilty, does someone who would commit such a high crime against their own country deserve to hold any office of honor or trust ever again? Consistent with the solemn oath we have all taken to do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws of the United States, that is the question every senator must answer in this trial. I yield the floor. Of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
Leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
First, briefly, Madam President, I'm pleased that Leader Schumer and I were able to reach an agreement on a fair process and estimated timeline for the upcoming Senate trial. This structure has been approved by both former President Trump's legal team and the House managers because it preserves due process and the rights of both sides. It will give senators as jurors ample time to review the case and the arguments that each side will present. On a completely different matter, on Saturday we lost a great statesman and scholar who gave more than 80 of his 100 years to his country. George Shultz's service began in the U.S. Marine Corps. From the beaches of Peleliu, he was among the Americans who helped retake the Pacific from Japan. Back home, he earned a PhD in economics. He taught at MIT and would later helm the University of Chicago's Graduate Business School. But public service beckoned, and George Shultz began a decades-long run of ping-ponging prolifically between academia and top government posts. The first of three presidents who'd benefit from his expert counsel, Dwight Eisenhower, hired him as a senior staff economist back in 1955. A decade and a half later, he was back, this time as President Nixon's Secretary of Labor, where he worked on desegregation and later as OMB director. Then at a pivotal moment for the U.S. and world economies, George Shultz was tapped to lead the Treasury Department. He fought inflation and worked to modernize our monetary policy so American leaders could control America's destiny. After an interlude in the private sector, Secretary Shultz's country came calling again. He spent 6.5 of President Reagan's 8 years as Secretary of State. He helped steer the smart and strong foreign policy that clinched the free world's victory over the Soviet Union. But even as the Reagan administration nudged communism into a box canyon, this top diplomat's master touch was vital in making sure that tensions did not rise too high. As amazing as it sounds, this impressive resume doesn't fully explain George Shultz's incredible reputation. It wasn't just all he did, it was how he did it. He led with thoughtfulness, fairness, and above all, integrity. He lived by the maximum he shared in his centennial reflection just a few weeks ago. Here's what he said: "Trust is the coin of the realm." His honesty and thoughtfulness won wide admiration that transcended politics. He won the trust of career diplomats and State Department staff, including those who did not naturally lean to the Reagan right. Famously, when new ambassadors met with him on their way abroad, the Secretary would spin a globe and ask them to point out their country. The unlucky ones who fell for the trap and pointed to their foreign destination were swiftly corrected. "No," he said, "your country is always America." At the McConnell Center at the University of Louisville, we host a distinguished speaker series. George Shultz honored us as the very first ever distinguished speaker back in 1993. And he kept right on writing and speaking and mentoring young people up until just a few weeks ago. America was his country, all right. He loved it deeply and served it always. The Senate's prayers are with the Shultz family and all their friends and colleagues he leaves behind. A truly remarkable life. In 2020, a Republican Senate and a Republican administration led 5 historic pandemic rescue packages on a completely bipartisan basis. We marshaled the largest federal response to any crisis since World War II, about $4 trillion across 5 bills, all of it completely bipartisan. But now Washington Democrats have other ideas. Even though we are still pushing out $900 billion in relief that Congress passed less than 2 months ago, Even though a group of Senate Republicans met with President Biden to discuss bipartisan avenues for hundreds of billions of dollars more, Washington Democrats have decided they want to go it alone. It was last March, remember, when a senior House Democrat called this disaster, quote, a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision. Americans are suffering, but their side seems to see an opportunity to ram through ideological change. That's the impulse behind Democrats' latest $1.9 trillion proposal. Their plan for more massive borrowing puts left-wing myths ahead of scientific evidence and the nation's urgent needs. While the Biden administration's own scientists say schools could reopen safely right now with smart and simple precautions, their proposal buys into the myth from big labor that schools should stay shut a whole lot longer. While Republicans want to save as many jobs as possible, Washington Democrats are backing Senator Sanders' demand to move to double the minimum wage. The Congressional Budget Office says this would kill 1.4 million American jobs. Nonpartisan experts say it would send more people to the unemployment line than it would lift out of poverty. But remember, this is all about liberal dreams, not urgent needs. Some Democrats even want to break Senate rules to jam this through. Last week, the Senate had a 14-hour voting marathon on amendments to the phony partisan budget that Democrats jammed through as a procedural first step. We got senators on record on a host of questions that matter to American families. Sadly, Democrats blocked our efforts to say that at the very least, school districts where teachers have been vaccinated certainly need to reopen, to press states to accurately report nursing home deaths, to protect the free exercise of religion, and several more. Other amendments divided Democrats and were adopted. For example, over some Democrats' objection, the Senate said illegal immigrants should not receive stimulus checks, that the Keystone XL pipeline should not be canceled, and that our government should not declare war on fracking. But, amazingly enough, at the end of the night, the very same Senate Democrats who sought to appear moderate by supporting these three things turned around and voted in lockstep to strip them all out again. Our colleagues who said they supported these changes voted to strip them right back out at the end of the evening. That's about as Washington, D.C. as it gets. For the sake of America's kids, America's jobs, America's health, Democrats should put the political games aside and resume the same kinds of bipartisan talks they demanded constantly all of last year. American families deserve a process and a bill that puts their actual needs at the center. Now, Madam President, on one final matter. Over the weekend, hundreds of thousands of protesters stood up across Burma in defiance of the military coup. For a week now, the military has detained hundreds of civil society leaders and Democratic elected officials, some on mysterious or obviously specious charges, and others without any charge at all. Their actions were illegitimate right from the start. And the treatment of these political prisoners is showing the world of the military regime's disdain for the rule of law. In the face of this tyranny and with the memory of how brutally the military has dealt with protesters in the past, the public unity of so many of Burma's people is a powerful display of courage. In far-flung cities and towns, members of the country's diverse ethnic groups, from the Burman majority to the Shan and Rohingya minorities, have rallied around the democratically elected government. They are demanding justice and an end to military rule. I've been encouraged over the past week by the diplomatic efforts undertaken by the administration to demonstrate the United States' condemnation of the military's flagrant assault on political rights. Today, it's time to follow up with meaningful cost on those who aid and abet the suffocation of Burmese democracy. The people of Burma in the streets today are putting their lives on the line. As one protester told the New York Times over the weekend, "I don't care if they shoot, because under the military, our lives will be dead anyway. Today, these protesters are joining in the same refrain heard repeatedly in places like Hong Kong, where democratic progress is too often met with jackboots. They're standing up for basic freedoms, and they're paying close attention to who will stand with them. Suggest the absence of quorum.
Call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
The senator from Nebraska,
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated, please.
without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to the floor today to discuss the administration's decision to extend the New START treaty by 5 years. Supporters hailed the move, with the New York Times reporting that the president's decision, quote, avoided a renewed arms race, end quote. Meanwhile, critics who believed the question of extension had given the United States leverage to extract concessions from Russia, as well as China, described the move as a wasted opportunity and a giveaway to Putin. As the last bilateral arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that the debate over extending New START took on outsized importance, with parties on both sides seeing it as the vehicle to accomplish all of their goals. Now, with the extension decided, it comes with an opportunity to regain our perspective and consider the way forward. This begins with a clearer understanding of what the New START treaty accomplishes and what it doesn't. To begin with, the New START treaty is not a panacea, and extending the agreement does not prevent an arms race with just the stroke of a pen. Nor is it an unfair agreement that locks in Russian advantages. It is simply an agreement between the United States and Russia to limit some, but not all, of the categories of nuclear arms. China is not a party to this agreement. As critics have pointed out, the treaty's counting rules obscure the true number of deployed nuclear weapons, and it has not prevented Russia's buildup of other kinds of nuclear arms, not covered by its limits. Some have described these as loopholes for Russia, but they are well-known limitations that also apply equally to both sides. Since the treaty was signed, the United States has chosen not to invest in new nuclear weapons outside of the treaty's limits. Well, Russia's done the opposite, and they continue to expand their nuclear arsenal. I disagree with my colleagues who see that as a failure of the treaty. It's a failure of the Russian government for continuing to build up its nuclear arsenal instead of matching our restraint and lowering those tensions. But it would also be a failure on our part if we had assumed Russia would refrain from building these systems out of the goodness of their heart. Indeed, Russia's behavior since the New START treaty was signed reminds us that it continues to seek a competitive advantage. And in order to achieve its goals, it will go around the limits, as it has done with the New START treaty, or it'll go straight through them, as it did with the INF treaty. So Russia's nuclear capabilities continue to expand, as does China's buildup of nuclear arms. That New START hasn't prevented these from occurring reflects the fact that the New START treaty simply does not account for the full spectrum of nuclear challenges. And thus, with the agreement to extend the treaty in place, serious threats still remain that really demand our attention. The growth of both Russia's and China's arsenals must be addressed. Some have called for the Biden administration to immediately pursue talks to this end. While hurrying to convene another diplomatic summit may have a reassuring appearance to some, diplomacy is not an end unto itself. It is a means to an end. And it is important to remember that negotiating limits on Russia's tactical weapons and bringing China into the arms control process have long been U.S. diplomatic objectives. Indeed, the Obama-Biden administration sought these goals, as did the Trump administration, which deserves credit for elevating them to the highest levels. However, the consistent refusal of both Russia and China to engage in serious talks demonstrates that neither nation feels sufficient incentive to negotiate. New attempts at negotiations without addressing this, it wouldn't achieve a different result. In truth, what's needed isn't another conference in a European capital. It is a serious effort here at home to create incentives for both Russia and China to halt their nuclear buildups and to have them choose a different path. Congress and the administration should work together to strengthen the hands of our negotiators. And to that end, we can start by rejecting calls being made by some advocates to cut our nuclear forces unilaterally or allow them to age into obsolescence by delaying their much-needed modernization. These calls aren't new. However, our senior military leaders have consistently advised against such courses of action, and the past two administrations have rejected them as well. They should be rejected again. As most in this chamber know, our nuclear forces have aged far beyond their designed lifetime. After delaying and deferring the modernization of our nuclear forces for decades, we are now at an inflection point. As Admiral Richard, the current STRATCOM commander, testified last year, quote, "Many of the modernization and sustainment efforts necessary to ensure the deterrence viability have zero schedule margin and are late to need," end quote. His point is clear. Further delay will result in capabilities aging out, with no replacements available. Our nuclear deterrent would literally wither on the vine. This would have a number of disastrous consequences for our security at a time when nuclear threats are growing, and it would also dramatically undermine future diplomatic efforts to negotiate limits with Russia and China on their arsenals. After all, why would either nation agree to new rounds of arms reductions if they knew that the United States was cutting its forces anyway, regardless of whether they agreed to do likewise? We must keep this in mind when we hear calls to dismantle the triad or cancel our modernization programs. Doing so would make our country less safe by cutting the forces needed to deter aggression, and it would make the world less safe by ensuring that the United States is never in a position again to push for real reductions to Russian and Chinese nuclear forces. Instead of reducing incentives for Russia and China to negotiate, Congress and the administration should work together to strengthen them and set the conditions for successful diplomatic efforts in the future. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. I would suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Madam President,
Senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, today I rise in support of my friend and fellow Minnesotan, Dennis McDonough, as President Biden's nominee for Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And no one knows but you, the Senator from Illinois, Madam President, about how important this job is for our veterans. Dennis grew up in Stillwater, Minnesota, which is right near the Wisconsin border. He is the grandson of Irish immigrants, the son of devout Catholic parents, and brother to 10 siblings. He attended St. John's College in Collegeville, Minnesota, and in addition to graduating summa cum laude, he played safety on the very proud championship St. John's football team. I've been privileged to call Dennis a friend for years, and I know he will serve our country well as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. As he has done his whole life, he will honor the promises that our country has made to our veterans and their families. Dennis's commitment to our nation's veterans was clear during his time as President Obama's Chief of Staff, where he made sure that every decision impacting our service members, veterans, and their families was befitting of their sacrifices. Showing respect and gratitude for our nation's veterans is not something Dennis just prioritizes, it's a value for him. As we know from his time as President Obama's Chief of Staff, he is an adept manager who understands how to tackle complex challenges throughout our government, which will be vital for the next secretary. As we also know, the VA is facing a number of challenges, from helping veterans to stay safe during the pandemic to improving the quality of care for veterans around the country. These are not simple problems, and these are not simple challenges, and they will require, as you have shown, Madam President, true leadership and vision, which have been, again, the hallmark of Dennis's time in public service. I also know that he will work tirelessly to find bipartisan solutions, and I think you see that from the support that he has gotten throughout the country, as well as on the Veterans Affairs Committee, where I was honored to introduce him when he started on this journey of Senate approval. And it has never been more important than ever to unite our country and get that kind of support. So much of our work with our veterans is about keeping our promises and showing respect, not just in words, but in action. When other senators who don't know Dennis as well or are new to Washington, what they may see as time goes on, you will see the qualities of honor and loyalty in Dennis's commitment to his family, which also includes his family in Minnesota, so I know this firsthand. He has so many relatives that you can't go anywhere without running into some McDonough. You see it in how he has treated everyone he's worked with. When he worked in the Senate, when he worked as President Obama's Chief of Staff. And I also will assure my fellow senators that he will listen to senators. He will have respect to the people that work here. You see it every day in how he always puts his country first. During his distinguished career, Dennis has approached each and every job with the spirit of respect, honesty, and collaboration, and a willingness to make himself accessible to his colleagues and his team. He is deeply committed to supporting the workforce at the VA, and I want our veterans to know he will do two things so well. He will listen, and he will get things done for you. One of my favorite stories about Dennis involves this: listening and then getting things done. We were having a lot of trouble up in northern Minnesota with the iron ore mines closing down, as you all remember, kind of coming out of the downturn. It never really bounced back, and then we had the steel dumping going on from China and other countries, the illegal steel dumping, and that really spread through the country and led to the closure of many of our mines. And we introduced legislation, and finally I asked Dennis to come up to northern Minnesota, since he was from our state, as President Obama's Chief of Staff, and sit down with a bunch of mayors from northern Minnesota, from Minnesota's Iron Range, with workers, with mine owners, and it was this long, long table, and nearly everyone had spoken. And near the end, a miner named Dan Hill, he was the last to go, and he said, well, everything's been said, but so I'll just tell the story. And he said that he was out of work, and he said that his son had just graduated from preschool. And the teacher asked him at the graduation, what do you want to do when you grow up? And kids were saying all kinds of things, that they wanted to play basketball or they were going to fly an airplane and all kinds of cool things. And Dennis's son looked at the teacher and he said, I want to be a miner like my daddy. And at that moment, Dan Hill took this steelworker t-shirt that he had in his hands and he threw it across the whole long table. And I remember sitting next to Dennis thinking, you were a football player, catch the t-shirt. And he caught the t-shirt. And Dan Hill says, Mr. McDonough, make it come true, make it come true. So Dennis listened, but then he acted. He went back to Washington, and he didn't just ignite a fire under the Commerce Department to get them to do even more work than they were already doing on enforcing tariffs and going after this illegal dumping and bringing things to the International Trade Commission, but he also looked at other agencies, and he helped us, along with Sherrod Brown and so many others, to pass legislation that made a difference. And all of this happened, and Dan Hill got his job back. And then I invited Dan Hill to come to one of the last State of the Unions for President Obama. And Dennis invited Dan Hill to the White House, and Dan Hill got to practically meet everyone surrounding the president. That is Dennis McDonough. He listened, but he didn't just say, oh, I got there, I went, we'll try our best. He actually followed through the minutia of government to get things done. I'm going to end with the words of a poet who President Biden happens to love. And given Dennis's Irish roots, I can't think of a better person to quote from today's vote. And it was Mr. Haney, who once wrote, anyone with gumption and a sharp mind will take the measure of two things, what's said and what's done. So Dennis will not just say words to the veterans of this country as your secretary, he will get things done. With that, Madam President, I ask my colleagues to support the nomination Dennis McDonough as Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Thank you, and I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President.
Senator from South Dakota. Oops, Texas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, it's been more than a month since a violent mob stormed this building and attempted to disrupt the congressional certification of presidential electors, the vote of those electors. Rather than a peaceful transition of power, some of the mob turned their grievances into violent action. But again, that's the problem with mobs. No matter what the intentions were of those who were simply exercising their rights to free speech and free assembly, mobs invariably degenerate into the lowest common denominator. That element of the mob assaulted police officers, destroyed property, and trespassed in the halls of the United States Capitol. Some roamed these halls in search of members of Congress against whom they actually threatened harm. And if not for the heroism of the men and women of the Capitol Police, the human cost would have likely been higher. The criminal acts of the mob were disgraceful and indefensible. Regardless of party or politics, there should be no disagreement on that most basic point. The people making up this mob came to Washington with the idea that the results of the 2020 election were not final. President Trump fed that fantasy by repeatedly claiming the election was stolen, even after he had exhausted all of his legal remedies in dozens and dozens of lawsuits. The president's actions were reckless. He should have known better than to stoke a flame he could not and did not control. But the events of January the 6th are only part of the story, and it is the congressional response, including impeachment, that I now want to talk about. Simply put, the snap impeachment raises serious questions about fundamental fairness, due process, or more accurately, a lack thereof. Unlike previous impeachments, there was no formal inquiry, no investigation, no hearings, no witnesses, no cross-examination, no nothing. We know impeachment is not like a traditional judicial proceeding. It's not a court of law. But it does make common sense, and I think this was the direction we gave the House during the last impeachment trial, that it's the House's obligation to investigate, develop the evidence, and then charge, not the other way around. Historically, this has been true for impeachment proceedings. Each time the House has conducted a full-scale investigation before a vote on the articles of impeachment. As I said, that was the case last year when the House spent months deposing witnesses, holding hearings, building a case against the president before ever announcing formal charges. But this time around, they took an entirely different approach. In attempting to justify this unprecedented departure from a fair and dignified proceeding, some of our Democratic friends claim that no evidence needs to be presented, saying that we were all witnesses to what happened on January the 6th, and that we can be jurors, witnesses, and in the words of at least one Democratic senator, victims